Lieutenant Commander Jake Vupert Dalton had seen plenty of Pentagon observers come through the squadron over the years. Clipboard carriers who'd never pulled 9 gigaseconds or felt the gut punch of a catapult launch. Bureaucrats in flight suits who showed up to critique people who actually knew how to fight. So when Captain Sarah Moore walked into the briefing room that particular morning, he didn't even bother hiding his smirk at yet another desk writer here to second-guess operational pilots. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the woman with the wire-rimmed glasses and ever-present notepad had more combat kills than their entire air wing combined. And in exactly 12 minutes, when 5 enemy fighters appeared on radar during what should have been a routine training exercise, she would climb into a cockpit and remind everyone that the most dangerous pilots are always the ones you never see coming. The USS Theodore Roosevelt sliced through the South China Sea under a sky that promised clear flying weather, and in the squadron-ready room, Captain Sarah Moore sat in the back corner watching 16 fighter pilots receive their morning brief from Commander Shotgun Martinez about standard intercept procedures, 4-ship flight at Angels 20 with red air coming from the northwest, all about proper formation discipline and communication. When Lieutenant Commander Dalton raised his hand to ask with barely concealed sarcasm whether their observer was going to critique them in real time or wait until after they landed to tell them everything they did wrong, scattered chuckles rippled through the room while Sarah's pen never stopped moving across her notepad. She'd been on the carrier for 3 weeks now, and the routine was always the same. Subtle mockery disguised as questions, assumptions that she'd never been in a fighter cockpit, the underlying belief that headquarters sent analysts to justify budget cuts and nothing more, and she let them believe it because the cover story worked perfectly when she gave people just enough expertise to be credible as an analyst, but not so much that they'd wonder where she'd really learned it, what nobody knew, what only a handful of people with the highest security clearances understood, was that Captain Sarah Moore had spent 4 years flying missions in aircraft that officially didn't exist over airspace where American pilots officially never operated, logging 2,400 combat hours with 14 confirmed air-to-air kills and turning down command positions twice because command meant less flying. She'd been among the elite, one of the best fighter pilots in the world, until one night her stealth fighter took a missile hit over contested airspace and she ejected, spending 12 hours evading enemy patrols before extraction only to wake up in a military hospital being told her flying days were over due to inner ear damage that created too much risk of spatial disorientation. 8 months of watching other people fly while she carried a clipboard and pretended to be something she wasn't had followed. 8 months of professional purgatory for someone who'd once been at the absolute top of her profession. But that morning something felt different, a crawling sensation between her shoulder blades, the kind of feeling that had kept her alive in situations where instinct mattered more than instruments. The brief concluded and pilots filed out toward their aircraft while Sarah remained seated finishing her notes, and Commander Martinez lingered to say she didn't have to keep taking their disrespect, but she replied that patience was easy when you knew something they didn't. Then offered a pointed tactical observation about vertical separation protocols that made him study her with new interest before she headed toward air operations to watch the launch. She found her usual observation spot and watched the 4 FA-18 Super Hornets taxi toward the catapults, Viper and Torch as flight leads with Jester and Snake on their wings. Then the familiar choreography of tension and full power and final checks before the catapult fired and sent each aircraft rocketing down the deck and into the sky. Within 5 minutes, all 4 aircraft were airborne and formed up, heading northwest toward the training area where Red Air aggressors would launch from Guam in 15 minutes for a standard intercept exercise, and Sarah poured coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and settled in to watch radar screens, thinking this was her job now. Observe and analyze and write reports that no one would read. Then the speaker crackled with a transmission from Combat Information Center that made Sarah's blood go cold. Multiple unidentified radar contacts bearing 285 degrees, range 175 miles, speed 500 knots. Count of 5 aircraft in tactical formation with transponders off. and Sarah was on her feet instantly moving toward the radar display before the air boss could even respond because she'd heard those exact words before in situations that had ended with people dying. Confirmation came through that these weren't their red air aggressors, that the contacts had originated from the northwest and the profile matched hostile fighters. And when the E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft confirmed 5 bandits matching J-20 stealth fighters crossing into international waters on intercept course for the training package, Sarah's mind shifted instantly from analyst mode to combat mode, a mental transition as automatic as breathing. She studied the radar display, calculating intercept angles and fuel states and weapons ranges. Seeing that the geometry was bad, the training package was 60 miles northwest, flying straight and level, completely unaware, while the hostile fighters were positioning for a classic ambush using their stealth characteristics to close undetected. Commander Martinez ordered a recall of the training package, but Sarah countermanded it with an authority that made everyone in Air Ops turn to stare, explaining that if they recalled the aircraft, now the hostiles would know they'd been detected and would adjust tactics, but right now they had a brief window where the enemy thought they had surprise. She moved to the tactical display, tracing the enemy formation with her finger, explaining that the J-20s were setting up a pincer movement, and if their pilots broke now, the hostiles would adapt and still have the advantage, that they needed to warn their aircraft and get them into defensive posture and get more fighters airborne immediately. The air boss studied her with sudden intensity and said she was talking like someone with combat experience, and Sarah met his gaze directly and replied that she had more combat experience than anyone else in that room, that she could talk them through the tactical response or get in a cockpit and handle it herself. But they were wasting time having this conversation while American pilots were about to die. For 3 seconds no one spoke. Then Sarah pulled off her wire-rimmed glasses and set them on the console, and without them her eyes were different, harder, colder, the eyes of someone who'd killed enemy pilots and slept fine afterward. She explained there was a ready bird on Catapult 2 and she could be airborne in 4 minutes. Could reach their training package before those hostiles got weapons lock, but she needed authorization now, and when the air boss hesitated, she moved toward the door, saying she was getting in that aircraft and he could either authorize the launch or explain to an admiral why he stopped her. She was sprinting through the carrier's corridors before anyone could respond, hitting the ready room at full speed to yank open her locker and pull on the flight suit that still had her old squadron patches, her hands steady and breathing controlled. As her mind ran through weapons employment sequences and energy management calculations, while Lieutenant Commander Dalton continued his training exercise, 60 miles away, completely unaware that 5 Chinese stealth fighters were hunting him. Sarah's boots hit the flight deck at a dead run toward the Super Hornet sitting on the catapult with engines already spooling up. And the crew chief did a double take because this wasn't the scheduled pilot, but Sarah cut him off asking for a brief while she strapped in. And the chief with 20 years on carriers knew when to ask questions and when to just make things happen. She dropped into the cockpit and 8 months of forced inactivity evaporated in an instant as her hands moved through the startup sequence with muscle memory that went deeper than conscious thought, harness clicking into place, helmet connected, oxygen flowing, weapon systems active, combat checks complete. The canopy came down and the world outside became muted, and for the first time in 8 months, Sarah Moore felt like herself again as she pushed both throttles to full military power, and the Super Hornet shook with restrained violence. 44,000 pounds of thrust, trying to push forward against the catapult holdback. She brought her right hand up in a sharp salute, confirming she was ready and trusted the machinery, and the launch officer touched the deck and the catapult fired. 0 to 165 miles per hour in under 2 seconds with crushing acceleration, and the deck edge disappearing and that terrible moment of free fall before the wings caught air, and then she was flying, climbing away from the carrier, and everything that had been wrong for 8 months suddenly became right again. She transmitted using her old call sign, Reaper, without thinking, and requested vectors to the training package and hostile contacts, and when Commander Martinez responded that she was not authorized, she replied that 4 American pilots were about to be ambushed by 5 stealth fighters, and she was the only asset close enough to help, asking if he wanted to give her the vectors or explain to their families why he didn't. After a moment of silence, the Hawkeye controller came on, giving her the tactical picture. Training package bearing 325 degrees, range 58 miles at Angels 20. Hostiles bearing 318 degrees, range 80 miles at Angels 25 in attack formation, and would reach weapons range in 4 minutes. Sarah banked hard left, climbing with throttles in full afterburner, and the Super Hornet leapt forward with the Mach meter climbing steadily as she requested rules of engagement, and the controller confirmed she was weapons-free on hostile contacts, because they'd activated fire control radar on the training package, which meant the J-20s weren't just probing or intercepting, but were preparing to shoot. Sarah keyed her mic with absolute authority and ordered Viper and Torch to cease training exercise immediately because they had 5 hostile stealth fighters inbound from their 11 and 1 o'clock positions at range 40 miles with radar locks on their aircraft, and this was not a drill, execute, defensive split now. 2 seconds of silence followed. Then Viper's voice, confused and irritated about an unknown caller on a closed training frequency. And Sarah identified herself as Captain Moore and told them they were going to be dead in 3 minutes if they didn't listen. Break right immediately for Viper, break left for Torch, get separation and go defensive now. Jester's voice suddenly cut through with alarm about multiple radar locks and someone painting him, and Sarah confirmed that would be the 5 J-20s about to kill them while her aircraft screamed through 25,000 feet. And this time Viper didn't argue as his training took over. The engagement unfolded with lethal precision as the Hawkeye controller reported the hostiles were splitting, 3 contacts continuing toward Viper and Jester while 2 contacts broke north toward Torch and Snake, professional and coordinated and aggressive. Whoever was leading those J-20s knew their business. Sarah checked her tactical display, running calculations at combat speed, and requested range to the northern group, learning they were 28 miles and closing, and had locked her up because they knew she was there, which was good because that meant they'd shifted attention from the training package to her. She selected her first AMRAAM missile and designated the lead hostile in the northern group, got the solid seeker tone and called Fox 3 as the missile dropped from her wing and ignited, accelerating to Mach 4 as it streaked toward its target, then immediately selected her second missile and locked the second hostile and fired again. The Hawkeye confirmed both hostiles were defending, and the first one just went ballistic. Then splash, confirmed splash on first contact, second hostile is splash. 2 kills for Sarah, who was already turning hard toward the remaining 3 J-20s. She ordered Viper and Torch to get their radars active and paint the 3 remaining bandits, told them when she called Fox 3 they should take their shots. And when Viper asked how she was doing this and who she was, she cut him off, saying, "Questions later, killing now, do you copy?" Her radar had the 3 remaining hostiles who'd broken off from the training package and were turning toward her, 3 stealth fighters whose pilots had just watched their wingman die and wanted revenge, and she selected her third AMRAAM and locked the lead aircraft just as her radar warning receivers screamed because one of the J-20s had fired at her. Sarah's mind split into parallel tracks of offense and defense and overall tactical picture, seeing that the incoming missile was a Place 15 long-range weapon fully capable of killing her, and she could go defensive and focus on survival and give up the initiative, or she could do what she'd done 14 times before in similar situations and trust her aircraft and press the attack. She locked her third AMRAAM on the hostile who'd fired at her and pressed the trigger, calling Fox 3. Then keyed the radio ordering Viper and Torch to fire on the remaining 2 targets now, and 4 American missiles went into the air while 1 Chinese missile came inbound on Sarah. She deployed chaff and flares and executed a high-G barrel roll that crushed her into the seat, with the Jesuit squeezing her legs and torso to force blood to stay in her brain. And the incoming missile went for the chaff and detonated 400 meters behind her while she rolled level and checked her display to see that Viper's missile had splashed 1 hostile and Torch's was tracking the second. Then she saw the geometry developing and called for Snake to break left immediately because the 5th hostile, the one everyone had lost track of, had used the chaos to get behind Snake's aircraft, and Sarah could see on her display exactly how this would end if she didn't act. She selected her last AMRAAM, but Snake and the hostile were too close and she couldn't fire without risking friendly fire, which left her 2 sidewinders and a problem that required getting much closer, so she shoved her throttles full forward and turned hard toward the engagement, pulling G's that made her vision tunnel as the Super Hornet protested, but held together. She closed the distance at supersonic speed and told Snake to brake left as hard as he could on her call, to trust her, and counted down 3-2-1-brake-now, and Snake's aircraft snapped into a hard left turn with the J-20 following his. Pilot focused on getting the kill and not seeing Sarah closing from above and behind. A fatal mistake, because in air combat the most dangerous threats are the ones you're not watching. Sarah selected her sidewinder and got the Heatseeker's growling tone as it locked the J-20's engines and fired from less than 3 miles, calling Fox 2, and the sidewinder leapt off her rail and tracked the J-20's hot exhaust while the hostile pilot realized his mistake 1 second too late, tried to maneuver and deployed flares, but the sidewinder detonated and shredded the J-20's tail section. The Hawkeye called Splash 5 and confirmed all hostiles splashed and battlespace clear, 5 kills in less than 12 minutes, and Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding before ordering all aircraft to form up on her. For return to carrier with Viper as flight lead of his section and Torch as lead of hers, checking fuel states and following her lead home. The 5 aircraft formed up and turned back toward the carrier as the adrenaline faded, and Sarah felt the familiar post-combat exhaustion settling in, but underneath it was something else, satisfaction. Maybe, or vindication. Because the doctors had been wrong and the medical board had been wrong, and now everyone would know it because you couldn't hide 14, now 19 air-to-air kills behind wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard. The landing was perfect, trapping the 3-wire exactly where she should after 8 months away, and she taxied clear and shut down the engines. And through her canopy she could see the crowd gathering on the deck because this was going to be interesting. Commander Martinez was first up the ladder as the canopy opened, his face showing relief mixed with something that might have been anger or respect or both, saying that what she'd done was either brilliant or insane, and Sarah started unbuckling and replied it was necessary. 5 hostiles splashed with 0 friendly casualties. That's called mission success where she came from. Martinez lowered his voice and told her the Kagi wanted to see her immediately, and there was already a call from Singpack wanting to know what the hell just happened. And Sarah said she imagined they did as she pulled off her helmet and her hair fell loose. Then told him she needed to debrief these pilots first because they'd just experienced their first real combat and needed immediate tactical debrief while everything was fresh, that the political conversations could wait 10 minutes. Before Martinez could argue, Lieutenant Commander Viper Dalton appeared at the base of the ladder, his face pale and flight suit dark with sweat and eyes showing the 1,000-yard stare of someone who just realized how close he'd come to dying. And he tried to apologize for the morning's attitude, but Sarah cut him off saying he didn't know and wasn't supposed to know. But now that he did know, they needed to talk about what happened up there and what he learned from it. The other pilots had clustered nearby, showing various stages of combat shock. The adrenaline crash and shaking hands and sudden awareness of mortality that Sarah had seen before, and she told them the first lesson was that real combat is nothing like training, that the second those radar warnings went off they all froze for critical seconds, and while that was normal for first contact, normal gets people killed, so from now on they train with the mindset that every exercise could become real without warning. She explained that what they saw her do was what happens when you have 4 years of combat experience instead of 4 years of peacetime training, that she'd been where they were today multiple times and survived because she learned that hesitation kills people. And they all did well once they got over the initial shock, but they were going to work on reducing that shock time to 0. When Viper asked if she thought the Navy was going to let her go back to carrying a clipboard after this, she replied that she just demonstrated exactly why analysts shouldn't be analysts if they have capabilities more useful elsewhere. But First, she had to go explain to several admirals why she violated numerous regulations and engaged enemy aircraft without proper authorization. Torch said softly that Sarah had saved their lives and that had to count for something, and Sarah replied it counted for everything or nothing depending on how the politics shook out, then told them to go debrief with their squadron and tell them exactly what happened. And when someone asked if they thought she should be court-martialed, remember that they were only alive to answer because she was willing to break the rules. She walked through corridors that seemed tighter than before and arrived at the CIG's office knowing that the next hour would determine whether she'd resurrected her career or ended it permanently, and Captain Wolfpack Wilson was on the phone. When she entered, gesturing for her to wait before fixing her with a look that could have stripped paint, saying that in the last hour he'd had calls from Singpak and Nevers, and the Pentagon and their embassy in Beijing asking what the hell just happened and why a supposedly grounded analyst just shot down 5 Chinese stealth fighters. Sarah met his gaze directly and explained that her actual service record was classified at a level he probably didn't have access to, that the medical grounding was precautionary and as today proved unnecessary, and the analyst cover was just that, a cover for work she did that officially never happened. Wolfpack leaned back and pointed out that 5 kills in one engagement was extraordinarily rare, that there were maybe a dozen American pilots alive today with 5 or more air-to-air kills, and she'd just joined that club while everyone was watching. And Sarah quietly revealed she'd had 14 before today, but most of those happened in aircraft and airspace they don't officially acknowledge. The CAG was quiet for a long moment before explaining that the Navy had a problem now because they couldn't court-martial her since the optics of punishing someone who saved American lives would be catastrophic. But they also couldn't just ignore that she violated regulations. And Sarah said carefully that they could use this as an opportunity because those 4 pilots he sent up today had no idea how to handle real combat. They froze and hesitated and made mistakes that would have gotten them killed if she hadn't been there, and the Navy needed to fix that, and she knew how. When Wolfpack realized she wanted a training command, she explained she wanted to build a program that produces pilots who can handle the kind of warfare they're actually going to face. Not peacetime exercises, but real combat against near-peer adversaries who know what they're doing, and that would require her to be medically cleared, so he should run whatever tests he wanted because she'd pass all of them since. There was nothing wrong with her that would prevent her from doing her job. The phone rang, and after listening, Wolfpack told her the Admiral wanted to see her in person and she had about 15 minutes to convince him she was an asset worth keeping instead of a liability that needs to be quietly transferred to a desk in Omaha, and Sarah stood and said she'd been lying to people about who she was for 8 months, but the truth was a lot more convincing. 4 months later, the Advanced Combat Training Program held its first class aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt with 16 pilots, selected not for their political connections but for their aptitude and willingness to be pushed beyond normal limits. And Lieutenant Commander Jake Viper Dalton stood in the back of the briefing room watching Captain Sarah Moore outline a tactical scenario that made half the students look nervous because she'd wanted to prove to him personally that the analyst he'd mocked was actually the best teacher he'd ever have. She told them that 3 of them would be dead in the first 30 seconds of this engagement, and the question was which 3 and what would the survivors do differently that keeps them alive. And Lieutenant Cassidy Torch Ryan leaned toward Viper and whispered that Sarah was terrifying. And Viper agreed but said she was the reason they were alive and everything she was teaching them worked, that he'd learned more in 4 months than in his previous 6 years combined. They watched Sarah demonstrate a defensive maneuver on the tactical display with her hands, moving through 3-dimensional space and explanations filled with details that could only come from actual experience, and the students were riveted, with that particular mix of fear and respect that characterized everyone who trained under the woman who downed 5 enemy jets in 12 minutes. Sarah finished her brief and caught Viper's eye through the window with a slight nod of acknowledgement and respect. That understanding between people who'd shared something that couldn't be explained to anyone who wasn't there, then turned back. to her students and said something that made them all lean forward, paying absolute attention. Because when Captain Sarah Reaper Moore talked about air combat, people listened. And the pilots she trained would carry those lessons into cockpits, where they'd face enemies who were fast and skilled and absolutely committed to killing them, but they'd also carry the knowledge that they'd been taught by someone who'd faced those same enemies and made it look easy, even though it never was.